60 feet. That is the height of a 6-story building, roughly the distance between the roof of a London townhouse and the pavement below. Now imagine holding an aircraft at exactly that altitude, not climbing, not descending 60 feet precisely, while flying at 230 miles per hour at night over water toward a wall of concrete that is being defended by anti-aircraft guns firing directly at you. If you are 1 foot too high, the weapon you are carrying will not work. If you are 1 foot too low, you will hit the water and disintegrate. The margin for error is not small. It is essentially zero. 19 Lancaster bombers attempted this on the night of May 16, 1943. 8 of them did not come back. 53 young men died. The oldest pilot was 32. The squadron leader who planned it, briefed it, and flew the first attack run was 24 years old. His name was Guy Gibson. This is the story of Operation Chastise, the night the RAF tried to break the dams of the Ruhr. To understand the Dambusters raid, you have to understand what the Ruhr Valley meant to Germany in 1943. The Ruhr was the engine of the German war machine. Its factories produced steel, weapons, ammunition, and the 1,000 industrial components that kept the Wehrmacht supplied. And those factories depended on water, vast quantities of it, for cooling, for power generation, for transportation along the canal system. That water came from reservoirs held behind a series of massive dams. The Möhne, the Eder, the Sorp, and others. The dams were enormous. The Möhne Dam alone was over 100 feet thick at its base, built of limestone rubble and concrete, holding back 130 million tons of water. Conventional bombing could not touch it. A direct hit with the heaviest bombs in the RAF's arsenal would chip the surface. The dam would absorb the impact the way a mountain absorbs rain. Enter Barnes Wallis. Wallis was an aircraft designer and engineer, the man who had designed the Wellington bomber and the R-100 airship. By 1942, he had become obsessed with the idea of destroying the Ruhr dams, and he had conceived a weapon that sounded, on first hearing, insane. A cylindrical bomb that would be spun backward at high speed before release, dropped from extremely low altitude, and would skip across the surface of the water like a stone thrown flat across a pond. When it reached the dam wall, it would sink along the face of the structure and detonate at depth, where the water pressure would focus the blast against the concrete. He called it upkeep. The physics were sound. Wallis had tested the principle with marbles in his bathtub and then with scale models at a testing facility. The problem was delivery. The bomb had to be dropped from exactly 60 feet, at exactly 230 miles per hour, at exactly 425 yards from the dam wall. At night, under fire. The Air Ministry was skeptical. Bomber Command was skeptical. But Wallis had supporters in high places, and the strategic prize, flooding the Ruhr, crippling German industry, was too significant to ignore. In March 1943, the project was approved. A new squadron would be formed specifically for this mission. It needed a leader. Guy Penrose Gibson was 24 years old in March 1943, and he had already completed 3 full tours of combat operations, 1 in bombers, 2 in night fighters. In Bomber Command, a full tour was 30 operations. The average life expectancy of a bomber crew was roughly 14 operations. Gibson had completed over 170. He was not lucky. He was exceptionally skilled, driven to the point of obsession, and possessed of a personal courage that was genuine but came at a cost. He slept badly. He drank more than he should have. He was demanding of his crews to the point of harshness, and he was demanding of himself past the point of reason. The men who flew with him respected him. Many of them were also afraid of him. He was exactly the kind of person you want leading a mission that most people would consider suicidal. Gibson was pulled off operations and told to form a new squadron, 617 Squadron, based at RAF Scampton in Lincolnshire. He was given the authority to handpick his crews from across Bomber Command. He chose experienced men, the best pilots and navigators and bomb aimers he could find. 133 aircrew in all, flying 19 modified Lancaster bombers. They trained for 2 months. Low-level flying at night, over water. Again and again. The Lancasters flew at treetop height over the English countryside until farmers complained and livestock panicked. They practiced over reservoirs in Wales and the Midlands, perfecting the technique of holding exactly 60 feet above water in darkness. The altitude problem was solved with an elegantly simple trick. 2 spotlights were mounted under each Lancaster, angled so that their beams converged at exactly 60 feet below the aircraft. When the 2 spots of light merged into one on the water's surface, the pilot knew he was at the correct height. The distance problem was solved with a handheld wooden sight, 2 nails in a piece of plywood, calibrated so that when the dam towers aligned with the nails, the aircraft was 425 yards out. These were not precision instruments. They were improvisations, built in workshops and tested in the air by men who would have to use them while being shot at. They worked. The crews were briefed on the afternoon of May 16, 1943. Most of them learned the target for the first time. The room went quiet when the reconnaissance photographs of the dams were pinned to the board. They understood what 60 feet meant. They understood what the flak guns on the dam walls meant. They also understood that Barnes Wallace, who briefed them personally, had tears in his eyes when he explained what he was asking them to do. The 19 Lancasters took off from Scampton in 3 waves, beginning at 9:28 p.m. They flew east across the North Sea at treetop height to avoid German radar, crossed the Dutch coast, and threaded through the flak corridors of occupied Europe at 60 feet, following rivers and canals, navigating by moonlight and dead reckoning. They began to lose aircraft almost immediately. The second wave, heading for the Sorp Dam, was hit hardest. 1 Lancaster flew into the sea. Another hit power lines and crashed in the Netherlands. A third was shot down by flak. Of the 5 aircraft in the second wave, only 2 reached their target. Gibson's first wave, 9 Lancasters targeting the Moan, arrived over the reservoir just after midnight. The dam was enormous in the moonlight, its towers rising from the water, the flak guns already firing. Gibson made the first run himself. He brought his Lancaster down to 60 feet over the lake, the 2 spotlights converging on the water beneath him, tracers arcing toward him from the dam walls. His bomb aimer released upkeep at the calculated distance. The bomb bounced across the water, struck the dam, sank, and detonated. A massive column of water rose into the air. The dam held. Gibson pulled up and circled back. He called in the second aircraft, Flight Lieutenant Hopgood. Hopgood's Lancaster was hit by flak on the approach. The aircraft caught fire. Hopgood held his course, released his bomb. It bounced over the dam wall and exploded on the far side, and then the Lancaster rolled and crashed. Of Hopgood's crew of 7, 3 survived. Gibson did something then that defined him. For the next 3 attacks, he flew alongside each approaching Lancaster, drawing fire onto himself to give the bomb aimer a clearer run. He flew parallel to the dam wall, his own aircraft silhouetted against the flak, pulling the gunner's attention while his squadron mates made their drops. The 5th bomb, dropped by Flight Lieutenant Maltby, broke the Moan. The breach was enormous. A wall of water 130 million tons strong surged down the valley below. In the moonlight, the crews could see the flood spreading across the landscape, carrying bridges and buildings and everything in its path. Gibson then led the remaining aircraft with bombs to the Eder Dam, a more difficult target, set in a steep valley that required a sharp diving approach followed by a pull-up over a hill on the far side. There was no flak at the Eder, but the terrain was treacherous. After 2 failed attempts by other aircraft, the Eder was also breached. The Sorp Dam, attacked by the remnants of the second and third waves using a different technique, survived. Its earthen construction absorbed the blast in a way that the masonry of the Moan and Eder could not. Of the 19 Lancasters that took off from Scampton, 11 returned. 8 were lost. 53 men were killed. 3 were captured and became prisoners of war. The floods from the Moan and Eder breaches killed an estimated 1,600 people in the valleys below, the majority of them forced laborers, many of them Soviet and Ukrainian prisoners of war held in camps along the river. This is a fact that the triumphant newspaper accounts of 1943 did not mention, and that histories of the raid have only fully reckoned with in recent decades. Gibson was awarded the Victoria Cross. 33 other members of 617 Squadron received decorations. Barnes Wallace, upon learning the cost in lives, reportedly broke down. Gibson himself wrote in his posthumous memoir that he felt a strange emptiness after the raid. Not triumph, not relief, but the particular numbness of someone who has seen too much and processed too little. The strategic impact of the raid is still debated. The dams were repaired within months. German industrial output in the Ruhr dipped but recovered. The raid did not break Germany's war machine. What it did break was the sense of invulnerability that the dams had represented, the idea that certain targets were simply beyond reach. And it gave Britain, in the dark middle years of the war, a story of extraordinary courage and ingenuity that meant something beyond the material damage. 617 Squadron went on to become the most elite precision bombing unit in the RAF, responsible for operations that included sinking the battleship Tirpitz with 12,000-pound tallboy bombs designed by the same Barnes-Wallis. The legacy of the Dambusters was not the dams themselves. It was the proof that seemingly impossible operations could be planned, trained for, and executed by ordinary young men who chose to do extraordinary things. Guy Gibson did not survive the war. On September 19, 1944, he was killed during a marking mission over Germany. He was 26 years old. His Mosquito crashed near the town of Steenbergen in the Netherlands. The exact cause was never determined. He was buried in the local cemetery by the Dutch, who placed flowers on his grave even under German occupation. He had flown over 170 operations. He had been awarded the Victoria Cross, the Distinguished Service Order with Bar, and the Distinguished Flying Cross with Bar. He was, by any measure, one of the most decorated and experienced combat pilots in the history of the Royal Air Force. He was also exhausted, worn down by years of continuous operations, and almost certainly should not have been flying combat missions in 1944. But he could not stop. The qualities that had made him extraordinary, the relentless drive, the refusal to stand down, the inability to ask others to do what he would not do himself, were also the qualities that killed him. The men who flew with him on the night of May 16, 1943, were mostly in their early 20s. Many of them did not survive the war either. Their names are on the memorial at the RAF Scampton Chapel, and in the records of the Commonwealth War Graves Commission, and in a story that has been told and retold for 80 years, not because the dam stayed broken, but because 133 men flew at 60 feet in the dark toward a wall of concrete and flak, and did not turn back. If this story moved you, subscribe to follow the Untold Front. New stories every week. A woman stands in waist-deep snow on a mountain pass between Poland and Hungary. It is January 1940, and the temperature has dropped past -20. She is carrying microfilm sewn into her gloves. Behind her, in occupied Warsaw, the Gestapo is tearing apart apartments looking for resistance couriers. Ahead of her, across the Tatra Mountains, a Hungarian contact waits in a village that may or may not still be safe. She is 29 years old. She is a former beauty queen contestant. She is skiing through a blizzard in the middle of the night, carrying intelligence that will reach London within a week. Her name was Krystyna Skarbek, though by the end of her life she would be known as Christine Granville. Churchill would call her his favorite spy. The SOE would consider her their longest-serving female agent. And when the war ended, the country she had risked everything for would give her a tiny pension and a polite suggestion to find clerical work. But that ending was years away. In January 1940, on a frozen mountain in the Tatras, she was just getting started. To understand what Krystyna Skarbek became, you have to understand what she already was. She was born Maria Krystyna Janina Skarbek in 1908, in Warsaw, into a world that was about to disappear. Her father, Count Jerzy Skarbek, came from minor Polish aristocracy, a family whose name carried weight even if the fortune behind it had mostly evaporated. Her mother, Stefania Goldfeder, was Jewish, the daughter of a wealthy banker. It was an unusual marriage for the time, bridging two worlds that rarely intersected in early 20th century Poland. Krystyna grew up between those worlds. She was athletic, restless, and possessed of a physical courage that people noticed early. She skied competitively. She entered and placed well in beauty contests, not because she cared about the title but because she enjoyed the attention and the freedom it brought. She was charming in a way that was not calculated but instinctive, the kind of person who could walk into a room full of strangers and leave with allies. She married twice before she was 30, both times badly. The marriages did not define her. What defined her was what happened when Germany invaded Poland on September 1, 1939. Within weeks of the invasion, Krystyna left Poland. Not to flee, to fight. She made her way to London and presented herself to the British intelligence services with a proposal that was, by any reasonable standard, audacious. She would return to occupied Poland, establish intelligence networks, and smuggle information back to the West. She was a Polish civilian with no military training and no intelligence experience. She was also completely serious. The British, to their credit, recognized what they had. She was recruited first by Section D of MI6, and later by the Special Operations Executive, making her one of the first women, and the longest-serving female agent, in the SOE's existence. Her first missions were extraordinary by any measure. Between 1940 and 1941, Krystyna made multiple crossings of the Tatra Mountains, the jagged range that separates Poland from what was then Hungary and Slovakia. She skied through passes at night, in winter, carrying microfilm intelligence about German troop movements, Polish resistance networks, and the growing evidence of what was happening to Poland's Jewish population. The physical demands alone would have stopped most trained operatives. She was doing it as a civilian volunteer, fueled by conviction and an apparently bottomless well of physical endurance. On one crossing, she was caught by the Gestapo at the Hungarian border. During the interrogation, she bit her tongue hard enough to draw blood, then coughed it up, convincing the officers she had tuberculosis. In 1940, tuberculosis was a death sentence and deeply contagious. They released her. She crossed the border the next day. This was not recklessness. People who worked with her, and the SOE files are consistent on this point, describe someone who was fearless but not foolish. She assessed situations with a speed that seemed almost instinctive. She read people accurately, and she had a quality that is hard to train into someone. She made the people around her braver. Polish resistance fighters who worked with her described feeling that, with Krystyna involved, things would somehow work out. It was not rational. It was real. By mid-1941, however, her cover in the region was blown. The Gestapo knew her name, had her photograph, and had put a price on her head. She was extracted to Egypt, where the SOE had operations running across North Africa and the Eastern Mediterranean. For 2 years, Krystyna operated in Egypt and the Middle East, useful work, but far from the front lines she craved. She was restless, difficult with bureaucracy, impatient with the slow grind of desk intelligence. The SOE records from this period show a woman who was brilliant in the field and nearly impossible to manage from behind a desk. In 1944, they gave her what she wanted. Operation Donner, southern France. She was parachuted into the Alps in July 1944, weeks after D-Day, to work with the French resistance in the Vercors region and surrounding areas. Her mission? Organize and arm Maquis fighters, coordinate sabotage operations against German supply lines, and prepare the ground for the Allied invasion of southern France, Operation Dragoon, scheduled for August. She was 36 years old, parachuting into occupied territory for the first time, and she performed as if she had been doing it her entire life. She organized supply drops, distributed weapons, recruited local fighters, and moved through German-controlled territory with a combination of forged papers, personal charm, and sheer nerve that left her handlers in London alternating between admiration and anxiety. Then came the moment that would become legendary. In August 1944, just days before the Allied landings in southern France, 3 SOE agents were captured by the Gestapo near the town of Digny. One of them was Francis Kammertz, Krystyna's partner and the SOE's most important circuit organizer in southeastern France. The other 2 were a French liaison officer named Zenfielding and a local resistance leader. All 3 were being held in a Gestapo prison and were expected to be executed within hours. Krystyna walked into the Gestapo headquarters. She identified herself, not by her real name, but as a niece of Field Marshal Montgomery and a representative of the Allied forces. She told the 2 Gestapo officers holding the prisoners that the Allied invasion was imminent, that the town would be liberated within days, and that anyone responsible for executing prisoners would be treated as a war criminal. She told them she could guarantee their safety if they released the men. She told them they had very little time to decide. It was a bluff. She had no connection to Montgomery. She had no authority to guarantee anything. The Allied invasion was indeed coming, but she could not have known the exact timeline. What she had was the force of absolute conviction, delivered with the calm authority of someone who has nothing to lose. The Gestapo officers believed her. They released all 3 prisoners. Krystyna walked out with Kammertz, Fielding, and the third man, and disappeared into the mountains. Some accounts suggest she also offered a bribe, 2 million francs, alongside the bluff. Whether it was the money, the threat, or the sheer improbability of a woman walking into a Gestapo prison and demanding prisoners that tipped the balance, the result was the same. 3 men who were hours from execution walked free. The liberation of southern France followed within days. Krystyna's work in the region was, by any operational standard, a complete success. She had organized resistance networks, distributed weapons, gathered intelligence, and pulled off one of the most remarkable bluffs in the history of clandestine warfare. She was awarded the George Medal, the Order of the British Empire, and the Croix de Guerre. Churchill, briefed on her exploits, reportedly called her his favorite spy. And then the war ended. What happened to Krystyna Skarbek after 1945 is one of the quieter tragedies of the 20th century. The SOE was disbanded. Its agents, many of them foreign nationals who had risked everything for Britain, were thanked, given modest pensions, and released into a world that had no particular use for their skills. Krystyna, now officially Christine Granville, was given British citizenship and a pension of £100. She had no family to return to. Her mother had been killed in the Holocaust, her father had died before the war. Poland, her homeland, was now behind the Iron Curtain and ruled by a Soviet-backed government that viewed former Western intelligence agents with deep suspicion. She could not go home. She took work where she could find it. She was a saleswoman. She worked as a telephone operator. She served as a stewardess on ocean liners, a job that used perhaps 1% of her abilities. She was 44 years old. She had been one of the most effective intelligence agents of the Second World War, and she was making beds on passenger ships. She had trouble adjusting. The qualities that had made her extraordinary in wartime, the restlessness, the intensity, the inability to accept things as they were, made peacetime difficult. She had been someone who mattered, doing work that mattered, and now she was no one in particular. On June 15, 1952, Krystyna Skarbek was stabbed to death in the lobby of the Shelbourne Hotel in Kensington, London. Her killer was Dennis Muldowney, a man she had met while working on the ocean liners, who had developed an obsessive fixation on her. She had rejected his advances repeatedly. He followed her to the hotel and killed her. He was convicted of murder and hanged. She was 44 years old. She is buried in the Catholic cemetery at Kensal Green in London, under the name Christine Granville. For decades, her grave was unmarked except by a small cross. In 1988, a proper headstone was finally placed, paid for by friends and former colleagues who had not forgotten what she had done. The story of Krystyna Skarbek is not comfortable. It does not end with recognition and old age. It ends in a hotel lobby, with a woman who had survived the Gestapo and the Tatra Mountains and the parachute drops into occupied France being killed by a man who could not accept the word no. But the discomfort is the point. Because her story is not just about what she did in the war, though what she did in the war was remarkable. It is about what happens when the war ends and the people who fought it are expected to become ordinary again. Some of them cannot. Some of them were never ordinary to begin with. Churchill called her his favorite spy. The SOE considered her their best. And after the war, no one could figure out what to do with a woman whose greatest skill was walking into impossible situations and walking out alive. She deserved better. She deserved to be remembered not just for how she died, but for how she lived, with a courage that was not performed but simply present, as natural and as constant as breathing. If this story moved you, subscribe to follow the Untold Front. New stories every week. December 7th, 1942. A submarine surfaces in the Bay of Biscay, 30 miles off the French coast. The sea is black. The wind is coming from the northwest at 15 knots. The temperature is just above freezing. From the forward hatch, 10 men begin passing up 5 canvas-hulled canoes, each 17 feet long, each weighing less than 100 pounds, each capable of holding 2 men and a set of limpet mines. The men are Royal Marines. They are young. The oldest is 29. They lower the canoes into the water, climb in, and begin paddling east, toward the mouth of the Gironde estuary. Their target is Bordeaux Harbor, 70 miles upriver. Their job is to attach explosives to German cargo ships. Their plan requires 4 nights of paddling, sleeping hidden on the riverbank by day, planting the mines on the 5th night, and then escaping overland through occupied France to neutral Spain. Of the 10 men who climb into those canoes, 8 will be dead within 2 weeks. 6 of them will be shot. Not in combat but kneeling, hands bound by firing squad. This is Operation Frankton. This is the story of the Cockleshell Heroes. The idea belonged to a man named Herbert George Hassler, known to everyone as Blondie, for the pale hair that had followed him since childhood. Hassler was a Royal Marines officer, a competitive sailor, an inventor of small boat equipment, and the kind of quietly obsessive military thinker who spent his evenings designing folding canoes while other officers drank gin. He was born in 1914 in Dublin, raised in Portsmouth, a Navy town, a Marines town. The sea was in the brickwork. He joined the Royal Marines at 18, served in Norway in 1940, and spent the early years of the war thinking about a problem that no one else seemed interested in solving. The problem was Bordeaux. Bordeaux, in 1942, was one of the most important ports in German-occupied Europe. It sat 60 miles up the Gironde estuary from the Atlantic coast, deep enough inland to be safe from naval bombardment, large enough to handle ocean-going cargo ships. The Germans used it as a base for blockade runners, fast merchant ships that slipped through the Allied naval blockade carrying rubber, tin, tungsten, and other strategic materials from Japan and Southeast Asia. These materials were essential to the German war machine. Without them, production of everything from aircraft tires to armor-piercing ammunition would slow. The Royal Navy could not get at them. The estuary was mined. The harbor was defended by shore batteries. A surface attack would be suicide. An aerial bombing raid would destroy the port and kill French civilians, and the port would be rebuilt. What was needed was something precise, something small, something that could slip past the defenses, damage the ships, and disappear. Hassler proposed canoes. The canoe he designed was called the Cockle Mark II, a folding, 2-man craft with a canvas hull stretched over a wooden frame. It could be broken down and stored in a submarine torpedo tube. It drew less than a foot of water. It was silent. It was, to anyone looking for it with radar or binoculars, effectively invisible. The plan was straightforward in the way that plans are always straightforward when described in a briefing room and never straightforward when executed in the dark on freezing water in enemy territory. A submarine would carry the team to the mouth of the Gironde. The men would paddle upriver over 4 nights, hiding by day in the reeds along the bank. On the 5th night, they would approach the cargo ships in Bordeaux Harbor, attach limpet mines to the hulls below the waterline, set delayed fuses, and paddle away. Then they would ditch the canoes, split into pairs, and walk south through occupied France to Spain, roughly 100 miles overland through enemy-held territory in winter. Combined Operations Headquarters approved the operation. Hassler selected his men from the Royal Marine Boom Patrol Detachment, a small unit he had formed specifically for this kind of work. He chose 10, including himself. They trained for months. They practiced night paddling, silent beaching, mine attachment, escape, and evasion. Then they went. The submarine HMS Tuna surfaced on the night of December 7th. The 10 men launched their 5 canoes in darkness. They were designated by fish names: catfish, crayfish, conger, cuttlefish, and coalfish. Hassler was in catfish, paired with Marine Bill Sparks. The trouble started immediately. Cuttlefish was damaged during launch, its hull torn on the submarine's casing. His crew, Marines Ellery and Fisher, could not continue. They were taken back aboard the submarine. 2 men down before the mission had properly begun. The remaining 8 men, in 4 canoes, began the long paddle toward the estuary mouth. The current was against them. The tide was running. The wind was cold and steady. They paddled in silence, 2 men to a canoe, stroke by stroke, mile by mile, into the darkness. The first night nearly killed them all. The tide rips at the mouth of the Gironda are violent. Standing waves, cross-currents, eddies that can spin a small boat like a leaf. Coalfish capsized in the turbulence. Its crew, Marines Sherd and Moffat, were thrown into the water. The water temperature was near freezing. Sherd died of hypothermia. Moffat was pulled from the water but was too cold to continue. Conger was separated from the group in the darkness and the confusion of the tidal race. Its crew, Corporal Laver and Marine Mills, were never seen again that night. They made it ashore eventually, but they were captured by German forces within days. From 10 men, Hassler was down to 6, 3 canoes. Catfish, crayfish, and 1 question mark. They paddled on. For the next 3 nights, the surviving crews paddled upriver. They moved only at night, covering 10 to 15 miles per tide. By day they hid, pulling the canoes into the reeds along the bank, covering them with camouflage netting, lying flat and motionless while German patrol boats passed within yards. They ate cold rations. They could not make fires. The December cold was relentless, damp, penetrating, the kind of cold that settles into the bones and stays there. They slept in their canoes, wrapped in whatever they had, waiting for darkness to fall so they could move again. On the second night, crayfish, crewed by Corporal Laver and Marine Mills, wait. That was Conger. The surviving crayfish crew was Corporal Laver and Marine Mills. The record becomes confused here because the after-action reports were compiled from Hassler's memory alone. What is certain is this. By the 4th night, only 2 canoes, Catfish and Crayfish, were still operational and in position. 6 men remained. On the night of December 11th, the surviving crews reached the outskirts of Bordeaux harbor. The German cargo ships were moored along the quays, large vessels, well lit, with sentries on deck and patrol boats moving slowly through the harbor. Hassler split the 2 canoes. Catfish would take the ships on the west bank. Crayfish would take the east. They agreed on a synchronized attack. Then they separated, and each canoe moved silently toward its targets. What followed was an exercise in nerve. Each pair paddled alongside the hull of an enemy ship, so close they could touch the steel, while sentries stood on the deck above them. They attached the limpet mines by hand, pressing the magnets against the hull below the waterline. The mines were set with delayed fuses, 9 hours. Enough time to get away. Catfish, Hassler, and Sparks placed mines on 2 ships. Crayfish, Corporal Laver, and Marine Mills placed mines on 2 more. The work was silent. The mines held. No one was detected. Then they paddled away. Downstream, past the harbor, past the patrol boats, into the darkness of the estuary. They ditched the canoes on the east bank, destroyed them, and began walking south. At approximately 6:30 the following morning, the mines detonated. 4 ships were damaged, 1 severely. The harbor was thrown into chaos. The Germans had no idea what had happened. Now came the hardest part. Laver and Mills walked south for several days before they were captured by German forces. They were interrogated, then transferred to military custody. Under Adolf Hitler's commando order of October 1942, a secret directive ordering the execution of all captured Allied commandos, regardless of whether they were in uniform, Laver and Mills were shot. So were Sergeant Wallace and Marine Ewart from Coalfish, who had been captured earlier. So were McKinnon and Conway from the other missing canoe. 6 men, all captured in uniform, all prisoners of war under the Geneva Convention, all executed under an order that was itself a war crime. Hassler and Sparks survived. They walked south through occupied France for nearly 100 miles, traveling at night, hiding by day. They were helped by the French resistance, a network of ordinary people who risked their lives and the lives of their families to shelter 2 cold, exhausted, hunted men they had never met. They were passed from safe house to safe house. A farmer's wife gave them civilian clothes. A schoolteacher hid them in a cellar for 3 days. A wine merchant arranged their passage across the demarcation line into Vichy, France. From there, they reached Spain, then Gibraltar, then England. They arrived back in London in April of 1943, 4 months after they had left. Of the 10 men who had launched from HMS Tuna, they were the only 2 to return. Lord Mountbatten, Chief of Combined Operations, would later say that Operation Frankton had shortened the war by 6 months. Historians have debated that number. The damage to the ships was real but not catastrophic. The blockade runners could be and were repaired or replaced. But the strategic effect was broader than the physical damage. The raid demonstrated that no port was safe, that the Germans could not protect their harbors from small, determined forces operating with audacity and precision. It forced them to divert resources to port defense across occupied Europe. Blondie Hassler received the Distinguished Service Order. Bill Sparks received the Distinguished Service Medal. The 6 men who were executed received nothing. Their deaths were not confirmed until after the war, when the commando order was entered as evidence at the Nuremberg trials. The officers who carried out the executions were tried and convicted. Hassler went on to become one of Britain's leading ocean sailors, designing a self-steering gear for sailboats that revolutionized single-handed sailing. He founded the Observer single-handed transatlantic race. He died in 1987. Sparks lived until 2002, a quiet man who rarely spoke about the raid. The Cockle Mark II canoe is in the Royal Marines Museum in Portsmouth, a flimsy thing, canvas and wood, less substantial than a weekend camping tent. It is hard to look at it and believe that men paddled 70 miles upriver in December, in the dark, toward ships full of enemies, carrying bombs. But they did. 10 men, 5 canoes, 1 raid, and the knowledge which they carried with them into the estuary, into the cold, into the darkness, that the odds of coming home alive were very nearly 0, and that they were going anyway. If this story moved you, subscribe to follow the Untold Front. New stories every week. Imagine a man who speaks 5 languages, holds an engineering degree from Cambridge, has spent 20 years building sugar refineries in the Egyptian desert, and has just turned 44 years old. Now imagine that this man, middle-aged, slight, with spectacles and a receding hairline, walks into a British Army recruiting office in Cairo and announces that he would like to go fight the Germans behind enemy lines. The recruiting officer almost certainly would have looked at him the way you might look at your accountant if he told you he was joining the circus. The man's name was Vladimir Peniakov. Everyone called him Popski, and within 2 years, he would be commanding the most improbably named military unit in the history of the British Army, Popskis Private Army. That was its actual name. On the official rolls, stamped on the paperwork, filed with the War Office. This is the story of how a Belgian-born, Russian-Jewish, Cambridge-educated sugar engineer became one of the most effective guerrilla commanders of the Second World War, and why almost no one has heard of him. Vladimir Peniakov was born on the 30th of March, 1897, in Belgium. His parents were Russian Jews who had left the Pale of Settlement, that vast strip of the Russian Empire where Jews were permitted to live, and settled in Brussels, where his father established himself in business. The family was cosmopolitan in the truest sense. Vladimir grew up speaking Russian, French, and Flemish. He was educated in Belgium, then sent to England, where he studied engineering at St. John's College, Cambridge. He added English to his languages. He would later add Arabic and Italian. The First World War interrupted his studies. He joined the French artillery, not the Belgian, not the British, but the French, because he happened to be in France when the war started and he was not a man who waited for paperwork. He served on the Western Front, survived, returned to Cambridge, finished his degree. Then he did something unexpected. He went to Egypt. For the next 20 years, Vladimir Peniakov built and managed sugar refineries in the Egyptian countryside. He married. He learned Arabic, not the formal Arabic of textbooks but the colloquial Arabic of fellahin farmers and Bedouin traders. He traveled widely in the desert, sometimes alone, sometimes with Bedouin guides who taught him navigation by stars and sand. He became, without intending to, an expert in desert survival. He was 42 when the Second World War began. He was 44 when he decided he had built enough sugar refineries. The British Army in Egypt was not, in 1941, in a position to turn down volunteers who spoke Arabic, knew the desert, and were willing to go behind enemy lines. They were in a position where Rommel's Afrika Korps was pushing east across Libya, and the entire British position in North Africa was in danger of collapsing. They needed men who could operate in the deep desert, gather intelligence, and cause trouble. Peniakov was commissioned as a second lieutenant. He was given a small patrol, a few men, a few trucks, a radio, and a set of maps that were mostly blank. His orders were to go into the Libyan desert, make contact with the Arab population, gather information about German and Italian movements, and report back. He was good at it. The Libyan desert in 1941 was a strange battlefield. It was vast, hundreds of miles of sand, rock, and scrub between the coast and the deep Sahara. Rommel's supply lines ran along the coastal road. Everything behind that road, fuel dumps, airfields, repair depots, communication lines, was protected by the desert itself. The assumption was that no one could operate there. Peniakov operated there. He drove his trucks deep into the sand seas, navigated by sun compass and dead reckoning, lived on tinned food and brackish water from desert wells that he found because the Bedouin had told him where they were. He gathered intelligence, troop movements, supply routes, the locations of fuel and ammunition dumps, and sent it back by radio. He also began destroying things. His first independent raids were small. A fuel dump here, a telephone line there, a few well-placed charges on a road that an Italian convoy would use the next morning. But Peniakov had a talent for this kind of work, a patience for planning, a tolerance for discomfort, and an instinct for the exact point where a small amount of damage would cause a disproportionate amount of chaos. He worked closely with the Long-Range Desert Group, the LRDG, the specialized reconnaissance unit that had been operating in the deep desert since 1940. The LRDG men were professional soldiers, veterans of long-range patrols, tough and competent. They looked at this middle-aged sugar engineer with his spectacles and his 5 languages and his habit of quoting French poetry while fixing a truck engine, and they decided they liked him. They started calling him Popski. No one remembers exactly why. It may have been because Peniakov was too long. It may have been because he reminded someone of a character from a newspaper comic. The name stuck. It would stick for the rest of the war and beyond. By late 1942, Rommel had been stopped at El Alamein, and the tide in North Africa was turning. Peniakov proposed something ambitious. He wanted his own unit, not a patrol borrowed from the LRDG, not a secondment to someone else's command, but his own independent force, small and fast, authorized to operate behind enemy lines with minimal oversight. The proposal went up the chain of command. It was approved. The unit was officially designated No. 1 Demolition Squadron, PPA. The PPA stood for Popskis Private Army. The name was suggested by a staff officer as a joke. Peniakov liked it. The War Office, in one of those moments of British military bureaucracy that defy explanation, approved it. Popskis Private Army. Official. On the books. The unit never exceeded 120 men. It operated with jeeps mounted with Vickers machine guns, carried demolition charges, and moved at night. Its mandate was simple. Get behind the enemy, break things, and get out before anyone figured out what had happened. In North Africa, PPA destroyed fuel dumps, cut communication lines, and raided airfields across Libya and Tunisia. They moved with the speed and unpredictability of a sandstorm. One week they would be 200 miles behind enemy lines in the Fezzan. The next they would be operating on the coast road near Tripoli. They blew up aircraft on the ground. They ambushed supply convoys. They mined roads and disappeared before the dust settled. Peniakov led from the front. He was not a desk commander. He drove his own jeep, carried his own weapon, slept on the sand with his men. He was, by all accounts, an unusual leader, cerebral, polyglot, fond of discussing philosophy over a campfire, but utterly unflappable under fire. His men worshipped him, not because he was brave, though he was, because he was competent, because he did not waste their lives, because he brought them home. When North Africa was won, the PPA moved to Italy. Italy was a different war. The desert was gone. In its place were mountains, rivers, mud, and a German army that had turned every ridge and every village into a defensive position. The wide-ranging jeep raids of North Africa were impossible here. The terrain was too close, too cluttered, too heavily defended. Peniakov adapted. He broke PPA into smaller patrols, 4 or 5 men, sometimes fewer, and sent them through gaps in the German lines. They operated in the mountains of central and northern Italy, linking up with Italian partisans, identifying German positions for Allied artillery, cutting supply lines, and generally making the German rear areas as uncomfortable as possible. It was in Italy, in the autumn of 1944, that Popskis' luck ran out, partially. He was leading a patrol through a village near the Gothic line when he triggered a mine. The explosion took off his left hand. He was evacuated to a field hospital, where the stump was cleaned and dressed. He was offered a medical discharge. He declined. He was fitted with a prosthetic hook. He learned to drive, shoot, and handle demolition charges with one hand and a piece of metal. He went back to the front. His men, when they saw the hook, said it made him look like a pirate. Peniakov said that was appropriate because he had always been a pirate. The army, he said, had simply failed to notice. PPA fought through the final months of the Italian campaign. They pushed north through the Po Valley, crossed into Austria ahead of the main Allied advance, and were among the first Allied troops to reach the Austrian city of Klagenfurt. The war in Europe ended on the 8th of May, 1945. Popskis' private army was disbanded shortly afterward. The unit's total strength, across the entire war, never exceeded 120 men. It had operated across 3 continents. It had been behind enemy lines more often than in front of them. It had destroyed more fuel, more aircraft, and more communication infrastructure than units 10 times its size. And it had been commanded, from first to last, by a sugar engineer with spectacles and a hook where his left hand used to be. After the war, Vladimir Peniakov drove through Austria in his jeep, as if reluctant to stop moving. He returned to England eventually. He wrote a memoir, Private Army, published in 1950. It is a beautiful book, understated and wry, written in the precise English of a man for whom it was a 3rd or 4th language. It sold well. Critics admired it. Then it went out of print and Popskis slipped into the footnotes. He tried to return to engineering. He found that peacetime bored him in ways that the desert never had. He was restless. He traveled. He moved between countries the way he had once moved between enemy positions, quickly, without announcement, following some internal compass that no one else could read. He died in London on the 15th of May, 1951. He was 54 years old. The cause was a brain tumor, a quiet civilian death for a man who had spent 4 years outracing anything the enemy could throw at him. There is a particular kind of soldier who does not fit the mold, who comes to war late, from an unexpected direction, carrying skills that no one thought were relevant until suddenly they were the only skills that mattered. Vladimir Peniakov was a sugar engineer who knew the desert. He was a polyglot who could talk his way through a checkpoint. He was a middle-aged man who refused to believe that the war was a young man's game. He built his own army, gave it a ridiculous name, and used it to do things that the official military histories still struggle to categorize. Was he a commando? A spy? A saboteur? A partisan leader? He was all of these things, and none of them, and the reason he is not better remembered is that the categories we use to describe war do not have a box marked Belgian-born Russian-Jewish Cambridge-educated sugar engineer with a hook for a hand who commanded a private army named after himself. Perhaps they should. If this story moved you, subscribe to follow the Untold Front. New stories every week. 98 bodies. That is the number they counted in front of the machine gun when it was over. 98 enemy soldiers, arranged in a rough crescent across the jungle floor, all facing the same direction, toward the gun and toward the man behind it. The man was a dentist. His name was Captain Ben L. Salomon, and when they found him slumped over the weapon on the morning of July 8, 1944, his body carried 76 wounds. 24 of those wounds were in the front of his body. The rest were in his back, his arms, his legs, wounds he had taken and ignored, wounds that should have killed him long before the last one did. He was 31 years old. He had been a dentist for 4 years. He had never wanted to be a soldier. This is the story of how a man who filled cavities for a living became the last line of defense for 30 wounded men on an island called Saipan, and why it took 58 years for anyone to officially say thank you. Ben Salomon was born on the 2nd of September, 1914, in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. His parents were Jewish immigrants. His father worked in a factory. His mother kept the house and kept the family moving forward in the way that immigrant families do, one generation's labor becoming the next generation's education. Ben was a good student. He was quiet, careful, the kind of young man who paid attention to details. He went to Marquette University, then to the University of Southern California, where he earned his dental degree in 1937. He opened a practice in Los Angeles. He was, by all accounts, a competent and well-liked dentist. He played poker on Thursday nights. He drove a Chevrolet. He was, in every measurable way, an ordinary man living an ordinary life. Then the draft notice arrived. In 1940, Ben Salomon was inducted into the United States Army as a private. Not as a dental officer, as a private. An infantryman. He carried a rifle through basic training, slept in a barracks, ate mess hall food, and marched in formation with men half a decade younger than him. It was a bureaucratic accident. The Army had drafted him before his dental commission paperwork was processed. By the time the error was sorted out, Salomon had already spent several months as a line soldier. He had learned to shoot. He had learned to dig a foxhole. He had learned, as every infantryman does, the particular mathematics of survival under fire, where to stand, where not to stand, how to read the sound of an incoming round. These were skills a dentist would never need. Until the morning they were the only skills that mattered. He was eventually reassigned as a dental officer and commissioned as a first lieutenant. By 1943, he was Captain Ben Salomon, Regimental Dental Officer of the 105th Infantry Regiment, 27th Infantry Division. He set up his dental chair wherever the regiment went, in tents, in converted buildings, once in the back of a truck. He pulled teeth. He filled cavities. He treated trench mouth and broken jaws. He was a dentist at war, which meant he was a dentist who happened to live near a war. That changed on the 15th of June, 1944, when the 27th Division landed on Saipan. Saipan is a small island in the Mariana Chain, roughly 12 miles long and 5 miles wide. In the summer of 1944, it was one of the most important pieces of real estate in the Pacific. The Japanese had fortified it heavily. Taking it would give American bombers a base within striking distance of the Japanese home islands. The invasion was brutal from the first hour. The 27th Division came ashore on the western beaches and pushed inland through sugarcane fields, rocky ridgelines, and a network of caves and tunnels that the Japanese defenders used with lethal efficiency. Casualties were heavy. The fighting was close, sometimes measured in yards, sometimes in feet. Captain Salomon set up his aid station in a tent behind the front lines. He worked on wounded men around the clock, extracting shrapnel, cleaning wounds, administering morphine, doing the grim triage that combat medicine demands. He was a dentist doing a surgeon's work because there were not enough surgeons. He was good at it. His hands were steady. His training in oral surgery, the same training that had taught him to extract a molar without flinching, translated, in ways no one had planned, to the work of keeping men alive under fire. By early July, the American forces had pushed the Japanese into the northern tip of the island. The defenders were running out of food, ammunition, and options. The Japanese commander, Lieutenant General Yoshitsugu Saito, knew the end was near. On the night of July 6th, he issued his final order. Every man who could stand was to attack. It would be a gyokusai, a final, glorious charge. No retreat, no surrender, death with honor. The attack came before dawn on July 7, 1944. Estimates vary, but somewhere between 3,000 and 5,000 Japanese soldiers, armed with rifles, bayonets, swords, grenades, and in some cases sharpened sticks, charged into the American lines along a front less than a mile wide. It was the largest banzai charge of the Pacific War. The first units to be hit were from the 105th Infantry Regiment, Ben Salomon's regiment. The sheer mass of the charge overwhelmed the forward positions within minutes. The line did not bend. It broke. Japanese soldiers poured through the gaps, past the foxholes, past the dead and dying, heading straight for the rear areas, where the aid stations were. Ben Salomon was operating on a wounded soldier when the first Japanese soldier came through the tent flap. The accounts of what happened next are reconstructed from the testimony of the few men who survived. The sequence is fragmented. The details are incomplete. But the core of it is this. A Japanese soldier entered the tent with a bayonet. Salomon killed him. More soldiers came. Salomon grabbed a rifle from a wounded man and fought them back. He ordered the wounded who could walk to start moving, away from the aid station, toward the rear, toward any position that was still held. He was not supposed to fight. The Geneva Convention is explicit on this point. Medical personnel are non-combatants. They wear the Red Cross. They do not carry weapons in combat. They are protected, and in return they do not fight. Salomon knew this. Every medical officer in the army knew this. But the Geneva Convention was written for a war in which both sides honored it. In the jungle of Saipan, at 4 in the morning, with wounded men on stretchers and enemy soldiers coming through the walls of the tent, the Geneva Convention was a piece of paper in a filing cabinet on a different continent. Salomon made his choice. He found a machine gun. Accounts differ on exactly how. One version says he pulled it from a destroyed position, another says he took it from a dead gunner. The gun was a water-cooled .30 caliber, the standard heavy machine gun of the American infantry. He set it up at the perimeter of the aid station. He told the remaining wounded to go. He stayed. What happened over the next minutes? An hour? No one knows exactly how long, is reconstructed from the physical evidence found afterward. Salomon fired the machine gun into the advancing Japanese. He was hit. He kept firing. He was hit again. He replaced the barrel of the gun when it overheated, a procedure that requires removing a scalding hot metal tube and replacing it with a spare, a task that requires both hands, clear thinking, and the kind of calm that has no business existing in the middle of a banzai charge. He replaced the barrel at least once, possibly twice. He was wounded repeatedly. He kept firing. The men he was covering, the wounded, the medics, the walking casualties, made it out. They reached positions that were still held. They survived. Ben Salomon did not. When American forces retook the position later that day, they found him slumped over the machine gun. The barrel was burned out. The ammunition was spent. In front of his position, in a rough arc that told its own story, lay 98 enemy dead. His body had 76 wounds. The medical examination that followed noted, with clinical precision, that 24 of those wounds were in the front of his body. He had been facing the enemy when he died. He had not turned away. The men who survived recommended him for the Medal of Honor. The recommendation was submitted through channels, endorsed by his commanding officers, supported by eyewitness accounts. It was denied. The reason was the Geneva Convention. Medical personnel are non-combatants. By picking up a weapon, Salomon had technically violated the law of war. The Army's position was that awarding the Medal of Honor for an act that was, by strict legal definition, a violation of international law would set a precedent it did not wish to set. The recommendation was resubmitted. It was denied again, and again, and again. Over the next 5 decades, supporters of Salomon, fellow veterans, historians, members of Congress, submitted the paperwork 7 times. 7 times the bureaucracy said no. The arguments against the award were always technical, always legal, always correct in the narrowest possible reading of the rules. And always, to the men who had been carried out of that aid station on Saipan while a dentist with a machine gun bought them time with his life, utterly beside the point. The world moved on. The Korean War came and went. Vietnam came and went. The Cold War ended. The men who had been young on Saipan became old men, and some of them died, and the story of the dentist with the machine gun became a footnote in regimental histories that fewer and fewer people read. On the 1st of May, 2002, 58 years after Ben Salomon died on Saipan, President George W. Bush signed the order awarding him the Medal of Honor. The ceremony was held at the Pentagon. His surviving family members were present. The citation was read aloud. It said what the men on Saipan had been saying since 1944, that Captain Ben L. Salomon, by his extraordinary heroism and devotion to duty, had saved the lives of his comrades at the cost of his own. He had no children. He had no wife. He had a dental practice in Los Angeles that he left behind in 1940 and never returned to. He had a Chevrolet that someone must have sold. He had a poker game on Thursday nights that went on without him. He was a dentist. He was a soldier by accident. He was a hero by necessity. And for 58 years, the country he died for could not decide whether what he did was courage or a violation, could not reconcile the simple human act of standing between the helpless and the harm with the tidy categories of a legal framework written for a tidier war. The men he saved never had that confusion. To them, it was always simple. A man stood up. He told them to go. He stayed behind. And he held the line until there was nothing left to hold it with. If the story moved you, subscribe to follow the Untold Front. New stories every week.